Hey.
Hello, Andrew.
Hey, Ed.
We had a kind of a pre-game talk before, and we actually saw each other, I guess twice this summer already. But before that, it had been some time. I was reminded. I was thinking about tonight and thinking about the book and thinking about sort of how we know each other, and I went back to I guess 2003 when your first book P came out, which I thought was tremendously impressive, and I did a profile of you and another author, Todd McEwen, and I was just reading that piece again and kind of remember. It's been a while since I've looked at P, and just remembering how amazing that book was. And I guess, I mean, I want to talk a lot more in detail about what happens in O Africa and sort of your thinking behind it. But I guess one thing that struck me about both P and O Africa is just how ambitious both books are in terms of scale and language. And I was telling someone earlier today, one of the things I like about your writing is that you are not a minimalist. You are all out, everything I got, and it's an overwhelming experience. It's really, really satisfying. So maybe my question is this the only mode in which you can function, in which you can write, at least when it comes to novels and fiction?
That's a great question.
Was that too ambitious for a
No. No, I'm glad you used that word. It's tough to write a book, right? So, you wanna test your talent against big themes, and you wanna see, the extent of what you have, and that it's a years-long commitment.
Yeah.
So the material, you want it to be rich enough that it's going to sustain you over that arc.
Right.
So. The first book is called P, and it's loosely it's a riff on Ulysses, right? It's basically Ulysses set in New York City in the late '90s, and instead of Bloom, the advertising man, you have this failed pornographer, and instead of Stephen Dedalus, you have this 10-year-old girl genius. And I was 23 when I started writing it, and I thought. I spent a year reading Ulysses, and I thought, I think I understand what he's doing.
Right.
And why don't I just rewrite it in New York? And that's the kind of very dumb thing that you do when you're 23, right? Because you don't know the limits, and you don't know enough to know what the boundaries are, right? But yeah, with this, I'm really delighted that you used both those words, ambition and maximalism. I love language too, and that's part of it also. That I want to test the language, and I think at least for now, that is the mode that I write in. I mean, this. So Saul Bellow is a big influence. This is definitely like a year of reading Saul Bellow, and
for O Africa.
Yeah. And I read
Henderson, the Rain King, and just everything.
Henderson, but all of it. Augie March. If folks haven't read Bellow, you should read Bellow. So a description. I remember reading a description of Bellow where the critic said that it's like opening a closet in a summer home, and just a cascade of things fall on top of your head. A tennis racket and a bowling ball and a suitcase, and boxes of trail mix, and just it keeps coming. And I love that exuberance. one adjective when three adjectives will do, that sort of thing. And it's a tough thing to control because it can very quickly become exhausting.
Right.
So to have that kind of exuberance and maximalism and also have it be very precise is a neat trick. But before we go any further, I just want to say Ed is the marquee dude here tonight, and I'm grateful for him for doing this.
It's my pleasure.
And the relationship, so you were the editor, the book's editor of the Village Voice, right?
Yes, many years ago.
Okay, so, and he was very kind to the first book, and then I wrote some reviews that Ed edited, and then also at The Believer, and like a wonderful, generous editor. And then I have a quick, funny story about the Strand, and then we'll keep going. But I didn't want to forget this. So my very first job, summers in high school and college, was at Book of the Month Club. And this was before Amazon, right? And Book of the Month Club was like a real big deal. You got your book every month. And it was a great summer job. And there was a closet with surplus books. And if you had the key, you could basically just get as many books as you want. Right. And I basically built up my library over these summers. And then the summer, I think it was the summer between, it was one of the college summers, they had like tons of multiple copies of books. Right, the last week, I brought in an empty suitcase, and I just filled it up with like 10 copies of Barbara Bush's biography and stuff, and I came to the Strand and sold all the books, and that was like lunch money. Art books get...
that's the key.
That's the key. Art books. More money. Anyway.
Yeah. No, well, I don't know if I should... I mean, I have a similar... I've sold many books to the Strand, and always grateful for that. Well, I like what you're saying. I mean, mentioning like a year of reading Bellow, sort of your... I guess maybe I want to take issue with something you said at this great talk reading that you gave at the Y earlier this summer. I'm probably misquoting or misrepresenting. You mentioned how important film is to you. It's obviously important, both for P and for O Africa. And I think you said something like, movies have influenced you more as a writer than books, or perhaps I'm misstating it. But I also feel like when we're talking about this kind of writing, I mean, of course it's books that you're getting it from. Like, there's no, I feel like everybody likes movies. Everybody has, we're inundated with it. But I guess I want to maybe explore a little bit your relationship with certain authors like Bellow. I feel like perhaps with P, obviously Ulysses is kind of the great model there, but I believe Nabokov was another favorite of yours.
Yeah.
And what are some other influences on you for this book in particular, perhaps, but also in general? And then are there other writers today that you kind of, like Bellow and Nabokov kind of being in the past, like are there writers today that you draw from or find something valuable in?
Yeah, sure. Jonathan Lethem, I thought Fortress of Solitude, I think is a really great book. I think it's one of those books that sometimes something's really praised, and even the praise doesn't get it right. So
it's like you cannot overpraise that book.
It's not even a matter of overpraising. It's a matter of getting it correct, right? So I think like the TV show Girls, I thought that a lot of people, even when they were extolling it, they didn't really get what that show's about. Lethem, I think, is great. David Foster Wallace, I think he was really trying to push fiction in a different direction, and but the film thing is important because, for this book especially, because one of the things the book was trying to do was, so it's set in 1928, 29, and the main characters are these two brothers who are working in silent movies. One of the things the book was trying to do is capture the moment in American culture when the culture shifted from a literary culture to a visual culture, right? And I do think that as writers we're probably more influenced by film and TV than we are by books. I think that by the time you and I are doing our stuff, we've I'll just take this for granted. We've logged more time watching, the Jeffersons and Facts of Life and Different Strokes than we have reading, classic novels in all likelihood. And our rhythms of scenes and dialogue, and how scenes can be cross-cut, come more from movies and TV. And I've always made this comparison between actors and writers. That it's basically the same thing. It's basically about empathy and about finding a nugget of identification and then amplifying it. But an actor does that through voice and gesture and movement, and a writer does it through language. But it's the same instinct. So if I'm watching on the waterfront, right? There's this great scene where Brando has this business with a glove, this woman that he's flirting with, and she drops the glove, and he picks it up, he puts it on his own hand, and everything about that scene, the subtext is with the glove, and it's all about the the psychology, externalizing the psychology. And I learned more about writing in that, by watching that scene than I do from reading, 20 books. So, and also I studied film. I'm untutored. I mean, I really, I didn't take writing classes. So,
so I'm curious, like with your first book, P, I mean, I love this idea of nobody's telling you, you can't, I mean, you call it a riff on Ulysses. It is, a riff is one thing. A riff sounds like, a joke or a short story, but this is a full novel where, it's been a while since I've read it, but I think it has the same number of chapters as Ulysses, are pretty much, but you're kind of doing, Ulysses is the book where every chapter is in a radically different style. He's doing amazing things, and you decided, well, maybe I could do that. How did you have the confidence, or how did you figure like this was something that, I mean, how many years did it take you to write the first book?
I wrote that pretty quickly. I started it when I was 23. I had a draft by the time I was 25, and then it took a while to find an agent and then a publishing house, and then it didn't come out till I was just about to turn 30.
Later.
But the writing of it was the
very
shortest
rapid
amount of time. But when I was writing that book, I mean, I could write for 10 or 12 hours at a time, unbroken.
I miss those days. How do you? What is your writing day like, or your writing schedule like?
I'm a Starbucks writer on the weekend. I mean, I have a very good and very demanding job and a kid, and so I'm pretty disciplined about
that time on the weekend,
5 or 6 hours in a Starbucks in the morning on a Saturday or Sunday. But that's all I can do. I mean, I'm just tapped out at that point. And you change as a writer also, I think, as you get older. I don't know if you found this, but so when I was 23 or 24, I could just I could go for 12 hours, and now I don't have quite that ferocity, but I feel like I know more. And
that's good. I'm not sure.
I'm more aware of the technique. I mean, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, you have a young daughter. I mean, family life obviously takes up a lot of time and a lot of energy. And maybe this just speaks to my own deficiencies, but I also find that writing now, it's so much. I mean, you talk about how we are kind of products of a culture where we watch more hours of the Jeffersons, and we see more movies than read classic books. But I also think even that has changed, and now it's the internet kind of suffusing everything. And I find that, I mean, maybe you're better at kind of blocking that out in general, but I find that incredibly hard to. Some days I can be good, or some weeks even, but it's such a omnipresent thing. You don't even have to be at a computer because it's on your phone. Do you have tactics to sort of defeat that temptation?
It's not so much defeating the temptation as holding on to a sense of purpose while you're writing a big, ambitious book.
Yeah.
Because the culture has moved past that, I think, by and large, right? So,
the culture's moved past the idea of the novel as
an object of central importance. So, I don't care how big the book is. The days are gone where everyone's read Catch-22, or everyone's read Lolita, or everyone's read Catcher in the Rye. I mean, the closest we've gotten to that is, maybe The Corrections, or, 50 Shades of Grey, or something like that. But
one or the other. Right.
So it's more about, so what is the novel's place in the culture? And, I'm not the first to say this, but I think the novel's place in the culture is becoming what poetry was 100 years ago, where 100 years ago, if you were moderately well educated, you graduated school and you had memorized, 100 poems, and that was part of a cultural legacy.
Right.
And now, poetry, by and large, it's for poets and academics, and I think the novel, the serious literary novel, is also becoming a similar kind of cult object. So as someone who is saying, this is what I want to dedicate my life to, right? The one and only life that one is given, and the culture. You're making a horseshoe, and you're just seeing Maseratis fly past you.
Yeah. So
it's more about holding on to a sense of purpose. And a great line from Norman Mailer, who's another one of my heroes, and crazy ambitious and all that. He had this great comparison. He said, you can make a comparison between novelists and terrorists, because they are working in isolation for years at a time with the fervent belief that if they can bring this plan off, it's going to change the culture, which is crazy.
I mean, that's a lot like DeLillo's. I mean, I said a similar thing about terrorists having the power to change the culture that novelists used to have.
They used to have now too, right? Yeah.
I mean, I'm fascinated by this also because as you were, perhaps we can talk about, as I hope we've made clear, like a long time has passed since between P and O Africa, between your first and second books. And how did you hold on to that sense of purpose? Like what was, given how many people read serious fiction, and I should also say this is a very, very funny book and it's entertaining, but you know what I mean, serious fiction that's not erotica, that's not 50 Shades of Grey. How do you, over the course of, several years, how did you kind of sustain that?
Yeah. So there was a book vision in between.
Okay. Tell me about that book.
Yeah. So I had an idea for two books after the first book, and one was sort of a loosely autobiographical college novel, and the other was this book. And my agent at the time said, write the college book because you can do it quickly, and and all that.
And did you write that quickly?
Yeah, I wrote the book, and it's sort of a mess, and there are a couple of pieces that got published, but the book didn't get published. And I think, and then I didn't write for a year or two, and it really was a question of when I started writing this, and I started this about 7 years ago, and when I started it, I kept saying to myself, it's either joy or nothing, right? I'm not expecting, to write full time. I'm not expecting it to be, quit my day job, any of that. It's
joy or
it's
nothing
gotta
in
be
terms of your.
I know too many writers who, when they talk about writing, they talk about it like it's this horrible burden and it's painful. To me, it's my favorite thing in the world. It's total freedom. Total freedom.
Right.
It's where I'm answerable to no one. It's where ungovernable.
Right.
Go anywhere and do anything. I love to write. Yeah. So when I started writing this book, I just said to myself, I'm either going to have fun with it or just not do it. And I don't, my wife, who set this up tonight, she's incredibly supportive. It's tough to, have a writer for a spouse. I don't watch sports, so my joke is,
I don't watch sports.
Yeah, you could have a husband who's watching, football for 10 hours on a Sunday, or golf or whatever. Or I trudge off to Starbucks and I do my thing. I come back and. You could tell within a minute if I had a good day, or
That's a very good argument. I don't watch sports either.
Yeah, so that's it.
I'm just on Facebook. Well, tell me about. Okay, so 7 years ago, tell me about what was the germ of the idea? How did this book come about? I mean, I think. If I haven't made clear, it's so different from P. I don't want to reduce it to a historical novel, but you're setting it in a different time.
It's different, but it's not. And you already touched upon like the importance of film, and you touched upon the ambition. Yeah. I would also there is some textural play in the book. So there's a short screenplay in the novel, and there's a break in the book where there's like a historic film. Entry, and there are things like that. So,
done in the voice of like a film scholar. Yeah, which is terrific. But definitely, there's less stylistic difference, obviously, than P. But just I guess maybe the idea of two filmmaking brothers and set in the 20s as visual culture overtakes the literature. Like what can you trace back to what the genesis of that was?
Yeah. So there was an article in New York Magazine about 10 years ago that Michael Wolff wrote about. It had something to do with the guy who had cataloged the world's largest vault of footage of the 9/11 attacks. Mm-hmm. And in this article, there was a one-line mention of the Korda brothers, who were these three brothers from Hungary, I think, who were filmmakers in the 20s, and they made a series of trips to Africa, and for like the next 20 years, anytime you'd see a Hollywood film set in Africa, if they'd cut away to a lion in the jungle, it was their footage. They'd made a vault of B-roll footage in Africa, and there was just one line about it, and I thought, oh my God, like there's a huge novel in there. Right. Coupled with that, again going back to Mailer, he had this great line in an interview once where he said minorities are the nervous system of America. Mm-hmm. Which I love. I thought that was such a great insight. So, I thought, all right, so I'll make these brothers, these Jewish guys, and they'll get mixed up with these black characters, and one of the brothers will be gay. And I was thinking about, the indigenous art forms in America, you could argue, are movies and jazz music and Broadway, and that's minority culture, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to write about that. I mean, again, that goes back to the ambition and wanting to write about America. And I would say that that's something that both books have in common, right? And then it just builds. I mean, you know this. I mean, it's a tough thing to describe how. I have a friend. Here's the other thing about starting a book. You don't want to start a book. You never want to start a book. So you do everything you can not to start the book. Okay. Because it's terrifying. It's going to take you years of your life, and in all likelihood, it's going to end in failure, right? So at least this is my experience. Yeah. What you do is you keep pushing it down and pushing it away until it just starts accruing, and it gets to a point where it's not like you wake up one day and say, today at 3 I'm going to start my book. You start scribbling, you start note-taking, and then suddenly you find yourself writing it. So when you can't, it's classic Freud, right? It's return to the impressed. When you can't push it down any further, that's it. And is that similar to?
That actually, as you were saying it rings very true. And thinking about my book, Personal Days, which I think, in a way is very different from your work, but in a way not, because the whole last part of it is basically I'm trying to do Molly Bloom. But I think when I was and I think I've probably said this before, like, it was like 40, I was like 40 pages into it before I realized I was writing a book. Like, these weren't just notes. This was something that I couldn't not write. But it took, I don't even know how many weeks it took until, and then and suddenly kind of the path became clear, I guess. But I'm interested, I love this idea of, there was a line in New York Magazine, and there was a quote from Norman Mailer. So those are like two pretty,
No, and then film, is always part of it.
Sure,
and here's another strand.
Yeah.
So, they're brothers, right? So I don't have a brother, but the book is dedicated to my sister. Mm-hmm. This is an interesting relationship, right? So, we were talking about this the other night, that if all goes according to plan, right, knock wood, your sibling is the person that knows you longest in your life, right? So that's a privileged role, because they basically become the family dramaturge, right? So later in life, they're the person that you turn to, and you say, is that how that happened? Was that as good as I thought it was? Was that as fucked up as I thought it was? As weird as I thought it was? That's a very, very privileged relationship. And then twins. I was always fascinated by twins.
Right.
And also really liked the idea of a split protagonist. So to have two heroes of the book. And one of the ironies of the book is that because of the time period and because the material is so fantastic, I thought, well, this isn't going to be autobiographical at all, right? But then what ended up happening was the two brothers dramatize some sort of struggle in myself or something, and you find the stuff becoming autobiographical by default. I don't know if you find that with your stuff.
As much as you say this is fiction, you can't help it.
It is fiction, but it's emotionally autobiographical, and that's irrespective of plot or time period. So that was part of it also, the sibling relationship.
What was I going to say? I guess, when did you know that? Was there a moment? I think we've been circling around this, but was there a moment where you kind of knew what the scale of this book was?
Oh yeah.
Was that pretty early on in the?
Yeah.
Okay.
So once I decided I really want to do this again, right? I was lucky to get into a couple of writers' colonies, and so that was like the spring of 2007, and I got into Yaddo and a great place in the Hudson Valley called Ledig House, and between the two of them, after 5 weeks, I had 100 pages, and I was just burning shit up, and I was freelancing at the time, so there was like a financial commitment. It was like, I'm going away to do this. I'm not making money. And I'm going to crank it out. And if anyone's ever been to these writer colonies, it can be, summer camp for writers. There's, a lot of people just hang out, and that's fine. That's part of the process too. But I was known as the guy who was just cranking it out. And there was a German writer at one of the colonies who, she was a short story writer, and she wrote one short story a year, and we'd go to dinner, and the running joke was, like, how many pages did you crank out today, Andrew? And I was cranking it out, and she had written like a sentence, and she was, which I totally admire.
Yeah.
I'm not that kind of writer, So when I came back, I had 100 pages. And the other thing, and the difference between the two books, I think I'd always set up a false dichotomy for myself between literary fiction and plot-driven narrative. And I find plot very difficult to do. And so because I find it difficult to do, I kind of poo-poo it. It's cheap, theatrics, and blah, blah, blah.
I'm above such.
I don't need a plot. And this is like a very heavily plotted book. And to my delight and relief, the plot mechanics were just propelling me. I mean, I just, and I really enjoyed that part of the book.
Yeah.
So.
And how did you, like, it's almost like, it sounds like you've sort of found yourself developing this new skill. Like, it's something that, I mean, everything kind of has a plot, but if you think of P or Ulysses, it's like, it's not like, you can't kind of describe it in a sort of action-packed way. Was there something that you figured out, do you think? Like, was there some, as you were writing and kind of figuring out how to do plot, was there some, I don't want to say trick, but something that hadn't occurred to you before, like, this is how
just that it's not, they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
You could do psychology and care about language and still have it be very, very plot driven, and that was a great delight. And
what about I mean, you've always loved film. You obviously know. We talked a little bit beforehand. There's a movie star of the 20s in the book who is clearly based a lot on Harold Lloyd. It's kind of the third of the great trilogy of silent comedians. What about, like, was there research that you had to do for this book, or how much? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Were there times where you actually had to find out things, or how did that work?
So you have to forgive me, Emily, because she'll have heard the answer to the question.
Oh,
but
okay.
So research, right? So I'd never written historic fiction before. So the big question at the outset for me was, it seemed like there were two ways to go. Either I could do a ton of research and hit a saturation point of authorial confidence, and then go, or just go and then find what I need as I go along. And I found that it was the latter. And part of the reason for that was I was doing some private tutoring at the time when I started working on this book, and so we were following the curriculum of these prep school kids. So we were reading, along with them, we were reading all these books from the 20s, right? We were reading, Fitzgerald and Hemingway and all that. And, this is very obvious, but it really hit me like a thunderbolt. A book written in its time is not a period piece, right? It's a book written in its time, right? So in Farewell to Arms, Jake doesn't say to Catherine, do you want this Clark bar? It's the #1 candy bar in 1928. It sold 3 million. He just says, you want a piece of chocolate. Yeah. So once I realized that, I thought, oh God, not that it doesn't need to be researched, but the other thing about research is that it's not about historic fiction. It's not about marshaling 1,000 factoids. It's about knowing when to drop. Knowing when to seed the text with one detail to get the reader on your side. And then once they say, yeah, this feels authentic, then they go with you anywhere. Right. So that's the first part of that answer. The second part of the answer, and there was research. There was research in silent film and Coney Island and Birth of Movies and a lot of stuff. But the other part was Africa. Big question. Do I set the Africa sections in a real country, or do I invent it? And I really struggled with that for a long time. And ultimately I decided to make up a country, because I thought if I set it like in Belgian Congo or something, I'm gonna research it for 2 years, and I'm gonna feel very constricted, and I'm gonna feel compelled to have sort of an anthropological veracity, right? And I thought, no, that part of the book has to be much stranger and sort of magic realist. And also part of the joke of the book is that the brothers don't know anything about Africa, and they go into this country, and they're filming the country, and yet that's what the movie watchers are going to think of as Africa. So that was sort of an alibi for me to keep this kind of ignorance. And then Henderson the Rain King and John Updike's The Coup, both set in Africa and magical countries. So the research is interesting. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this idea of an alibi. Like I find also that as you're writing, you make certain decisions and you're kind of justifying them to yourself, but in a way you envision, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're envisioning like a reader who is also potentially very critical and kind of.
I don't think about a reader at all when I'm writing.
Do you not think about a reader?
I'm my ideal reader. I'm writing the book that I want to read.
Yeah.
I'm writing the book that that the world doesn't have that I want to read, or else why would I write it?
Why would you spend years bringing it
that book
into the world?
And then hopefully someone will want to read it. I mean, it's fun. I just don't think about an audience at all.
Should we ask some questions? Okay. I feel like we could talk for another hour, but let's. Are there? I'll use this one.
Does anybody have any audience questions they'd like to ask? I'm going to bring it in next so that we can have it pre-recorded.
Hi. Can you tell us a little something about the next book? And I think all your books are very different from each other.
So, the next book. It's going to be a big break from this. It's going to be a contemporary workplace novel. So,
nice.
Similar to, in some ways, to Personal Days, because I feel like work is a great subject, and I feel like it's not. I don't feel like it's really being written about in the way that it could be. And part of the inspiration for that is that. Both my parents are retired, and they've been retired for 10 or 15 years now. And if either of you were plucked out of the home and dropped into a New York City office today, you would not know what the work product is. You would not know what a work day is. And that shift has happened very, very fast. And so Barbara's here. Barbara's one of my first bosses. And I remember, so I started working 20 years ago, and I still remember, this is before email came in, and I still remember typing on an IBM electric typewriter fax cover sheets that we would fax the reports to California. The shift with the 24/7 communications and devices is profound, and what that shift does to a person's inner life and family life, I think is something that's not really been explored, and I think it's a big subject, and I want to test my talent against that subject, and I think. So that
sounds right up my alley. What do you? You've started writing.
Yeah.
Do you worry at all how a workplace narrative will be received by people that you currently work with, where they'll tend to find themselves in the narrative?
No, not really. And we have, one of the good guys here. No, I mean it's a separate thing. I mean, I have it's a separate.
Sounds like you're constructing an alibi.
No. I do a good job. I take it seriously. But I have another life, and it's separate, and
Absolutely, I'm just having.
But it's not. Yeah. But it's. I don't want to write. It's not slander. It's not an expose. But I do feel like work, and what it looks like today, and how different it is than 10 or 20 years ago is something really worth exploring. So that's what I'm working on. What are you working on? You said you're.
Oh, I don't know. Stories. Nothing. Well, actually, it's not about work. I do find in some of the stories, not even really by design, but they are about, I wouldn't call them science fiction, but technology sort of comes in. So like one story, there's like this weird app. Another story, there's like kind of like, I've never done Google Glass, but like weird things happen with Google Glass. So some of the stories, I don't know, when you were talking, it just reminded me like, these are, the world now is different than it was 5 years ago, and 5 years from now it's going to be completely, things will be completely unrecognizable. So I think of a story about 3D printing, which I don't really know anything about, but it's just like the fact that these things are going to become more commonplace, I think is
If I could just make a plug for Ed's book, because it came out like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's a great workplace novel, and one of the really magnificent things about it is that there are a few great things about it, but one of the things I loved about the book was that it's set entirely in the workplace. You never know the name of the company or what they do. And part of the point, I think, I don't want to be presumptuous, but part of the point was that it's all about the relationships and the culture, and also there's like a secret language that they have, right? And
Definitely.
That was a great part of the book, that it's almost like this Orwellian thing where like they're indoctrinated and they have this language.
Yeah, it's true.
And that was a great insight that, God, you wrote a workplace novel and you don't even know what the
I'm eager
work
to
product
see
is.
your updating of the workplace novel, because I think it does. I mean, if there's one thing about that book, I just feel like certain things are. I don't dare look at it again, because I think certain things are probably a lot different now. So it's always interesting to see what kind of the next installment or the next iteration.
It frustrates me in film too. Like you never really see people working. I mean, I love procedural stuff, right? Like show me how to do something, and I'm a sucker for that. But like, we've all seen a gazillion cop movies, and most cops in movies, they're not police officers. They're superheroes with guns. That's all they are, unless it's The Wire, right? So you never really. There are very few, like all the President's Men. That's a great procedural movie, right? Like there's certain films that like really get into like how do people do stuff, and I just feel like it's vast unexplored territory, and something I really want to write about.
I think we had a question out to the side.
When you were writing it, were you thinking about it being a movie? Because the language is so lush.
Yeah.
And when I came in late, so maybe I missed that aspect of it, but it seems to me when you talk about serious novels being of almost like the past, and this niche that may not exist much longer, I'm not sure it's true, because sometimes when things like this are made into film, people go back and read the books because they know they're richer and they know that they're made of so much more. There's so much more to tap into.
That's what's so interesting, though, that it takes Stephen Colbert plugging a book for that book to take off, or it takes the movie adaptation for them to people to go back and read the book. Yeah, sure, I'd love for it to be made into a movie, and also I don't know if you find this, but if I'm stuck or if the language starts getting away from me, I always go back to sensory stuff, right? Like what are the characters seeing, what are they hearing, what are they smelling, what are they touching, and like very visual, right? So John Updike is someone I love, and the rap on him is that just this lush descriptive prose. He trained as a cartoonist and an artist. He wanted to do that, and the visual description comes from there. And sometimes when I'm writing, I'll think about an actor for a certain character, or even just a moment in a movie. So there is that weird play, between the mediums. And also, when you're working on a book and it's going well, your antenna is up, and you start when it's going really, really well, you feel like everything is sending a signal your way, right? So movies or TV or music, things at work, things at home, and then you start pulling into it, right? So I listen to music when I write, and I listen to a lot of Bob Dylan when I write. So there's this great song on the Basement Tapes where a character enters the song by way of Ferris wheel. And I was like, what a fantastic way for a character to enter a book, right? So I took that, but you know what I mean? That happens, and so you just pull from everywhere.
When you're in that state, you're very receptive to.
You're very receptive.
Anything that's coming from anywhere. Yeah. That sounds right.
Are there questions?
I feel guilty to ask you a question because I've asked you a lot of questions about this book. But one of the things I wondered is, I mean, you talk a lot about silent film, and so I understand why the book needs to be set in the 20s for that. But I wondered while you were writing it, if you saw connections between the 1920s and now, I mean, aside from the big things like love and sex that always stay the same, if there are kind of driving forces or emotional tones to decades, I wondered how you relate to this time period and then to now.
Wow, that's a really good. I hadn't thought of that until you said it. But I guess you're right in terms of like just the culture changing. Yeah, I really hadn't thought of that. And like the Great Gatsby movie that came out, right? I thought I was going to hate it, and I actually thought it was pretty good. And it was trying to make that connection between, you know, Wall Street and hip hop and that kind of decadence in the 1920s. Yeah. And I thought it did it pretty well, you know. Maybe that was bubbling underneath. That, I mean, that's part of writing too, that there's a lot of it that's unconscious. I don't know if you find this, but so we were talking earlier about, you know, being a Starbucks writer, right? Mm-hmm. And having like that shift on the weekend. That doesn't mean that I'm not writing the whole week, right? So if I stop on a Sunday and I have like a tricky plot thing or a character thing that I haven't worked out, I know that there's part of my brain that's working on it the whole week. Right. I might not be, you know, sitting there working on it, but, or, you know, there are 3 scenes in the book that come directly from dreams I had. Mm-hmm. You know, you really, once you're really cooking with a book, it starts to take over. You could dream in character. It's a very strange, it really is a strange, it's a strange thing. It's a strange thing to write a book.
I feel like I've said in panels and stuff that I feel like when you're really deep into it, you are almost like going crazy. You are maybe I've said too much, but where everything you look at or hear is somehow attaches itself to what you're doing, and I don't know. And in a way, it's kind of a little bit scary. Like I mean, it's incredibly, you know, pleasurable and fulfilling, but it also means you become someone else for, you know, a pretty intense chunk of time. So
this goes back to the analogy between writers and actors, right? Which I really do feel you can make. Yeah. You know, and they talk about like, well, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis became this character, which I think is just nonsense. It's because it's you know, you don't become something else. You explore this thing, mm-hmm. and you identify with it, and then, you know, you blow it up, mm-hmm. And you have that privilege then to, you know, see the world through a movie director in the 20s, or, you know, a king of an African kingdom or something like that. Yeah. But to your point, I'm one of those writers who walks around, you know, mumbling dialogue to himself. I mean, it's crazy, you know. Yeah,
I will often just like look for any scrap of paper and like write down a little note or something I overheard, and then put it in my pocket, and then like, I don't know, a couple days later, what is this? And then write it in a notebook. Anyway,
That's about all the time we have for today, unfortunately. We'd like to thank Andrew and Ed very much on behalf of the Strand for joining us this evening.